Welcome back, everyone, and we are continuing with our sectarian, our lesson today on Jewish sects today, which, just as a reminder, is not another word. We're talking about S-E-C-T-S, or different denominations among the Jewish people at this time. And today we're going to be talking about the Pharisees, Sadducees, and the Essenes, which are an interesting bunch. We have our sources at the bottom, so let's jump into this because I'd like to save some time today. Here's a lesson outline for us. In the writing Pirkei Avot 1-2, as we covered last time, it says the world exists through three things: the Torah, the temple service, and acts of chesed, acts of loving kindness. So we're also going to be talking about what do Pharisees, Sadducee, and Essene even mean? What do these words even mean? And where did they come from? And we're going to be looking at some selections from Josephus' book Antiquities, which talk about their beliefs and practices. So, I know you probably already figured this out by the title, but how many different major denominations or sects were there? According to Josephus, he says, the Jews had for a great while 3 sects of philosophy, or thought, or worldviews, viewpoints. This is not the Greek kind of philosophy, but he's writing for Greek people, and so he's trying to use their language to try to communicate as best as possible. The Jews had for a great while 3 sects of philosophy, peculiar to themselves: the sect of the Essenes, the sect of the Sadducees, and the third sort of opinions was that of those called the Pharisees. Elsewhere in his book Antiquities of the Jews, he says, the sect of the Sadducees, whose notions are quite contrary to those of the Pharisees. So we see that the Pharisees and the Sadducees are not really friends. Their beliefs are quite contrary to each other, as we will see shortly. So we're going to be covering in this slide traditionalist origins of the Essenes and Pharisees. There were non-Hasidic traditionalists, which were the general population, and there were people who kept the law, who kept God's commandments, but wanted to go above and beyond what was required. So we are required to, for example, if you're a farmer, leave a border around your field of crops that go unharvested, and leave that for the poor. But the Bible never tells us how thick that border needs to be. Does it need to be 1 row of corn or 10 rows of corn? That's kind of important, isn't it? So the legalist, the person who wants to kind of wiggle their way out of things, would leave 1 row of corn, for example, which barely feeds the poor. But a Hasidic farmer, somebody who is pious, somebody who loved God and who wanted to show that by loving their neighbor, they would leave a thick border of crops so that enough food would be there to actually fulfill the commandment of feeding the poor. And so we have these 2 groups called the Essenes and the Pharisees. And the Essenes, possibly, we don't actually know where the name comes from. It possibly comes from Hesim, which is Aramaic for Hasidim. Or it comes possibly, although very unlikely, from Hosios, meaning holy in Greek. But the Essenes were pretty anti-Hellenistic, so it's probably not the case that it came from the Greek. But it's similar to how the Pharisees were called Purushim, or separated ones, holy ones. Now the Pharisees, as I just said, were called Purushim. They mean separated ones, and both of these groups believed in the entire Tanakh. They believed in the entire Bible, the entire Old Testament, and they were both anti-Hellenists. They did not like Hellenism, they did not like paganism. They loved God, and they loved the Bible, and they loved biblical culture, which had developed from the Bible. They interpreted the Tanakh via an orally transmitted tradition, passed down from teacher to student. And the student would eventually become a teacher, and he would pass that on to his students, and to his students, and to his students, and so on, for many generations. It's kind of like how Yeshua himself never actually wrote a book in the Bible, but instead he taught orally, and his disciples wrote down what he taught. His disciples taught what he spoke. It's kind of a connection there. So, regarding the Hellenistic origins of the Sadducees, as we remember from last time, we were talking about Tzaddik and Bezos, who were the disciples of Antigonus of Soko. The Sadducees, or Tzaddokim, from Tzadok, means the Zadokers, or the Zaddokites. They were influenced by Hellenistic practices, and they claimed to only accept the Torah, nothing else. Only the first 5 books. They denied the prophets, they denied the writings, they denied the oral traditions, and they're somewhat akin to the Samaritans today. Remember, we talked about the Samaritans a few lessons ago, because the Samaritans were claimed to be Torah-only people too, and they followed non-standard practices. They basically made it up as they went along. And for those of you who have heard of the Karaites, Sadducees are not the ancestors of the Karaites. They're actually quite a bit different in a few ways. So focusing on the Sadducees for a little bit, according to the record of Josephus, Josephus says about the Sadducees, "But the doctrine of the Sadducees is this, that souls die with the body," meaning that there's no afterlife or resurrection. The Sadducees didn't believe in a resurrection. "Nor do they regard the observation of anything besides what the law enjoins them," meaning that there's no grace, there's no spirit of the law, there's none of the stuff that, as Christians, we would all value. "For they think it an instance of virtue to dispute with those teachers of philosophy whom they frequent," referring to the Pharisees. So they think that it's a virtuous thing to argue with people and to cause division and conflict and turmoil. This doctrine, referring to Sadduceeism, is received but by a few, yet by those of the greatest dignity, meaning the elite. It's referring to the rich people and government authorities. But most people didn't buy this stuff. But they are able to do almost nothing of themselves, for when they become magistrates, when they get government jobs, they addict themselves to the notions of the Pharisees because the multitude would not otherwise bear them. So basically, the Sadducees were horribly unpopular people, and nobody agreed with the Sadducees. The people, the common people, like Jesus, like the disciples, they all agreed with the Pharisees. And so when the Sadducees would get in power, the Sadducees sometimes had to do things the Pharisaic way, because otherwise people would get really mad, and they'd protest, and they'd maybe kick people out of office. And even though the Sadducees claimed to be Torah-onlyists, they still violated Exodus 23 verse 2, which says, "You shall not follow the masses in doing evil, nor shall you testify in a dispute as to turn aside after a multitude, in order to pervert justice." And the Sadducees thought that the Pharisaic interpretations were wrong. So because they thought they were wrong, they were actually violating Exodus 23, which they claimed to believe in, which said, "Don't follow the masses in doing what's wrong," even though they thought that the Pharisaic masses were wrong. So it kind of goes to show us how much they actually valued or didn't value God's word. So switching to the Pharisees, there's actually in historical accounts, there's not a whole lot of information about the Sadducees, but we do know that much. So switching to the Pharisees, who we know a little bit more about, we read, also according to Josephus in the same general passage, he says, "Now for the Pharisees, they live meanly, or averagely, and despise delicacies in diet." They don't eat a lot of fancy food. "And they follow the conduct of reason, in what that," meaning reason, "what reason prescribes to them as good for them, they do. And they think that they ought earnestly to strive to observe reason's dictates for practice." Meaning, in other words, they follow their conscience, unlike the Sadducees, whose practices depended on political and social variables. like we just covered. They also pay respect to such as are in years, referring to the elderly. They respect their elders. Nor are they so bold as to contradict them in anything which they have introduced. So if their father said, here's the correct interpretation of Torah, they're not going to say, oh, Pops, that's stupid, I'm not going to obey that. They said, yes, sir, no, sir, yes, ma'am, no, ma'am, right? They minded their manners. They honored their parents, which is a biblical commandment. Now, regarding, this is the following passage is in regards to the concept of the good inclination and the evil inclination. It's our inward battle between wanting to do good and falling into temptation. And when they determine that all things are done by fate, or providence, they do not take away the freedom from men of acting as they think fit, since their notion is that it hath pleased God to make a temperament whereby what he wills is done, but so that the will of men can act virtuously or viciously. So basically, the Pharisees believed in free will, which I know some people don't believe in today, even some Christians, but the foundation of the Nazarenes believed in free will. They also believed that souls have an immortal vigor to them, and that under the earth there will be rewards or punishments according as they have lived virtuously or viciously in this life, and the latter are to be detained in an everlasting prison, but that the former shall have power to revive and live again. So basically, the good will be rewarded and resurrected and will be happy. The wicked will be punished. Those who were, quote, vicious in this life, they are put into everlasting prison, and they are not going to be rewarded. Now, if this sounds familiar, now you know where it comes from. The concept that good people go to heaven and bad people go to hell is kind of a bit of a twisting of the Pharisaic idea. It's an idea which has roots in Phariseeism. And, I would add, these are true things. We see this in the New Testament as well. We see that in, I think it's places like in Jude, that the wicked will accompany the evil angels and be imprisoned and punished. Now, Josephus continues. He says, on account of which doctrines they are able to greatly to persuade the body of the people. So when they talk about an afterlife, when they talk about punishment and reward and going to heaven, going to hell, things like this, they are able greatly to persuade the body of the people, meaning that these beliefs were very popular. They were accepted by basically everyone, except the Sadducees. And whatsoever they, the priests, do about divine worship, prayers, and sacrifices, they perform them according to the Pharisees' direction. So the temple was being run according to Pharisaic halacha, or according to the proper traditional way of doing things. If you remember, the Sadducees didn't even accept most of the Bible, so how on earth are they going to know how to do most of the biblical injunctions when they don't even accept them? So, now according to our friend Lawrence Schiffman, who is a professor of biblical history, and whose book we have read passages from in this course, it says, in rabbinic sources, the Pharisees are sometimes designated as the sages, because the rabbis were the continuators of the Pharisaic tradition. So basically what he's telling us is that when we hear about the Pharisees or the rabbis or the sages, these are all, from a kind of a far back perspective, from a general perspective, these are all basically the same people. There are some subtleties and there are some nuances, but we're basically talking about the same kinds of people here. They're not nearly as different as Pharisees and Sadducees. Continuing, Schiffman says they represented primarily the middle and lower classes. Right? Blessed are the poor. This is a Pharisaic message. They represented the poor people. They represented the farmers and the builders, the tradesmen, the craftsmen, the lumberjacks, the construction workers. These are the Pharisees. These aren't just some rich snobs running around, pointing fingers at people. Secondly, because of their social status, they were really not Hellenized and seem to have remained primarily Near Eastern in culture. They did not adopt this kind of Greco-Roman European culture. They retained their ancient Jewish culture. They were the authentic Jews. And they were extremely scrupulous in observing the law and were expert in its interpretation. Right? These are the people who knew what they were talking about. And in fact, there's a spot in the Gospels where Jesus even says, the Sadducees don't know what they're talking about, but the Pharisees, they're not far from the truth. It's one of my favorite passages in the Gospels because it's almost comical in the way that he treats the Sadducees. It's like, ooh, you do not know the scriptures and you do not know God. That's kind of harsh. But he says the Pharisees could not have emerged suddenly, full-blown, in the Hasmonean period. Meaning these people just didn't pop up, around the time of the Maccabees. Their theology and organization must have been in formation somewhat earlier. Now, if we remember, the Pharisees were part of this Hasidic mindset. And the Hasidim are mentioned in the Psalms, meaning the Hasidim go all the way back at least to the time of King David. And really, for people to know about who the Hasidim were, they probably had to exist at least the generation before David. But, arguably, they probably go back all the way to Adam, in some form. Continuing with the Pharisees, they were called advocates of the people. And continuing with Josephus' account, he says, they that were the worst disposed to him were the Pharisees, who are one of the sects of the Jews. The Pharisees were the worst disposed to this certain king. He was a wicked king. They have so great a power over the multitudes that when they say anything against the king or against the evil high priest, it was an evil high priest, Josephus just says against the high priest, the people are presently believed, or the Pharisees are believed by the people. So when the Pharisees say, the time has come, this is a wicked, godless king, the people rally to their side. When they say, the high priest is wicked, he's desecrating God's name, he's spitting in God's face, he needs to go. This is the last straw. The people get on their side. Continuing with Josephus, he says, so the Pharisees made answer that he, this is referring to a certain guy, it's a long story, that he deserves stripes and bonds, meaning whip him and put him in prison, but don't do anything else. But that it did not seem right to punish reproaches with death. So basically, whip him, put him in jail, but don't kill the guy. That's extreme. Remember, we are Pharisees, we're Hasidim, we believe in chesed, mercy. Punish him, but don't kill him, right? And indeed, the Pharisees, even upon other occasions, are not apt to be severe in punishments. At this gentle sentence, King Hyrcanus, who was a Hasmonean king, Hyrcanus was very angry. He wanted this guy killed. He had insulted the king. And this made him leave the party of the Pharisees and abolish the decrees that they had imposed on the people and punish those who observed them. So basically, when the Pharisees didn't side with the king, he kicked him out and he stopped being a Pharisee. He's like, I'm not going to play with you guys anymore. This is stupid. He leaves them, he kicks them out of the government, and he starts persecuting them because the Pharisees were not moved by political whims. From this source, the Pharisees arose that hated, from this source, the Pharisees arose that hatred which he and his sons met with from the multitude. So basically, what Josephus is saying, because he was persecuting the Pharisees, this really, really angered people. This severely angered people because the Pharisees were on the side of the people. They represented the poor, and there really wasn't a middle class back then, but the poor and the less poor. Continuing with Josephus' account, he says, "What I would now explain is this, that the Pharisees have delivered to the people a great many observances by succession from their fathers." Josephus admits that Pharisaic observances are passed down. They weren't just invented out of nowhere. Now, if we could also maybe take a peek at Acts 22, verse 3, that might help us. But for the sake of time, I'll let you do that if you so wish. "They delivered to the people a great many observances by succession from their fathers, which are not written in the law of Moses." Again, this is not written law, it's oral law. And I think, if I remember correctly, Acts 22:3 is referring to Paul saying that he has done nothing against the customs. He's not transgressed the Torah, the temple, or the customs. I think that's the verse that we're talking about. And for that reason it is that the Sadducees reject them and say that we are to esteem those observances to be obligatory which are written in the Word, but are not to observe what are derived from the tradition of our fathers, even though Paul says that he agrees with it, in Acts 22, which is basically the end of Acts. And concerning these things, it is that great disputes and differences have arisen among them, while the Sadducees are able to persuade none but the rich, and have not the populace attentive or obedient to them, but the Pharisees have the multitude on their side. So basically, they are the defenders of the people, and the people support them. The people agree with the Pharisees, generally speaking. They might not always obey them, because that's always a problem in any religion. The leaders are always usually more observant than the people. And really, that's the way that you would want it too, right? Now, something I just want to note real quick. It's Josephus says it's based on the oral law. It's based on concerning these things. It is that great disputes and differences have arisen among them. Do we not find this in the book of Acts? Paul says, "Brothers and men of Israel, I am a Pharisee and a son of a Pharisee, raised in this city at the feet of Gamaliel. And concerning the resurrection of the dead, I am being put on trial." The Pharisees say, "Resurrection of the dead, this is wonderful. We have a brother. He's done nothing wrong. He's one of our friends." And the Sadducees say, "This man's insane. Resurrection of the dead doesn't happen." And so they argue. They start arguing because Paul not only says that he's a Pharisee, but he proves that he's a Pharisee by saying, "I believe in the resurrection of the dead," which is a Pharisaic belief. You will not find this other than maybe one or two places in the Bible explicitly, clearly told. Usually, it's inferences. For example, the Pharisees say that because Abraham was promised the land of Israel, but he never got to settle there, for God to fulfill his promise with Abraham, he needs to resurrect Abraham, bring him back to life so that he can live in the land. That's one of the places where this idea of resurrection of the dead comes from. It's not, it doesn't say in, Daniel chapter 15 that one day everyone's going to be resurrected, we're all going to go to heaven in the rapture, and we're going to have a great party or something like that. And there is no Daniel 15, by the way. Maybe that's in Second Opinions chapter 3 or something, I don't know. But continuing with Josephus' account, he actually mentions our old friend Gamaliel. He says, "To Simon, the son of Gamaliel," this Simon was of the city of Jerusalem. So we see that Gamaliel and his son were both in Jerusalem. "And a very noble family of the sect of the Pharisees." So their family is a Pharisaic family, "which are supposed to excel." This is not saying they're supposed to, like they have to, but they're saying everybody believes that they excel others in the accurate knowledge of the laws of their country. "He was a man of great wisdom and reason, capable of restoring public affairs by his prudence. So basically, whenever there's trouble, people look to him. They say, look, you're the man for the job. You can get this done. Now, in Acts 21, verse 17 through 22, we read, "And when we were come to Jerusalem, the brethren received us gladly. And Paul went in with us unto James, and all the elders were present. And when they heard it, when they had heard Paul's report, they glorified the Lord and said unto him, You see, brother, how many myriades, how many thousands of Jews there are, which believe. They believe in Jesus, right? They didn't stop being Jews. They continued being Jews. But they accepted that Jesus would be the Messiah. And they are all zealous for the law." They're not just ho-hum kind of believers. They are zealous about the law. And the people who are like that today are persecuted and mocked and made fun of and lied about, and which is unfortunate. Even though these are the original believers. The original Jerusalem believers where the church was started, so to speak. "And they are informed of thee," about Paul, "that you teach all of the Jews which are among the Gentiles to forsake Moses, saying that they ought not to circumcise their children, neither to walk after the customs." This is referring to halakha. To walk, that's actually what halakha means. It's how to walk. That's you want to look it up, just look it up. It means to walk. After the customs. So people are getting these rumors that Paul is teaching against circumcision, to forsake Moses, and to not have the halakha of the customs. Now, what does Paul have to say about this? He says in the next chapter, he says, "I am truly a man which is a Jew, born in Tarsus." So Paul doesn't say he's a Christian, he says he's a Jew. He's born in Tarsus, a city of Cilicia, yet brought up in this city of Jerusalem, at the feet of Gamaliel, which we just saw, he was a Pharisee, and taught according to the perfect manner of the law of the fathers. If we remember, Josephus says that the Pharisees had received traditions from their fathers, right? And Paul says that he was taught according to the perfect manner of the law of the fathers, and was zealous toward God, as ye all are today. So he's zealous, he's obeying the law of the fathers, which would include the written and oral instructions that were passed down throughout time. He was taught by the Pharisee in chief Gamaliel, who was the head of the Sanhedrin, and he's in Jerusalem. I mean, how much more Jewish can you possibly get? And James even says that there was these false rumors going around saying that Paul was teaching against the halakha, even though he wasn't. So, yeah. We can see how the pieces of the puzzle are maybe coming together. Now, continuing, the Pharisees were actually anti-government preachers. And there's connections with the New Testament, as we'll see. In Antiquities, Josephus says, the sect of the Pharisees, who were in a capacity of opposing kings. I love the way that he says that. They were in the capacity of opposing kings. And they were believed to have the foreknowledge of things to come by divine inspiration, meaning that they were prophets. They foretold how God had decreed that Herod's government should cease. So the king slew such of the Pharisees. So basically the Pharisees prophesied, Herod's government is going down. There's going to be an end to the rule of Herod. And so what does Herod do? He kills him. Instead of changing the way that he does things, instead of being righteous, he just kills the people. He shoots the messenger, basically. Now, what do we read about in Matthew 14? We read, For Herod had arrested John the Baptist, chained him, and put him in prison on account of Herodias, his brother Philip's wife, since John had been telling him, It is not lawful for you to have her. Skipping to verse 10. So he sent orders and had John beheaded in the prison. We see that Herod was killing the Pharisees because the Pharisees had prophesied against him, And now John the Baptist is saying, hey, Herod, you can't do that. You're doing what's illegal. Off with your head. Right? Herod is just a murderous maniac. In Luke chapter 13, we read, at that time, some Pharisees came and told Jesus, go get out of here. Herod wants to kill you. They're warning Jesus that Herod's about to kill him. Well, first of all, why is Herod trying to kill Jesus? Now remember, it says that the sect of the Pharisees were in the capacity of opposing kings. John the Baptist, he's dead. Jesus, he's almost dead. Herod wants him dead. And certain Pharisees come to Jesus and they warn him. They say, look, there's a bounty on your head. Herod wants to kill you. Interesting. Now we'll be transitioning to another movement within the Hasidic mindset. We find the Essenes. And the Essenes, according to Josephus, are described as such. The doctrines of the Essenes is this. That all things are best ascribed to God. Everything comes from God. They teach the immortality of souls, just like the Pharisees, and esteem that the rewards of righteousness are to be earnestly striven for. Again, it's like the Pharisees. Now, the Essenes did not participate in temple services. The Pharisees did. Now, in this way, they were a little bit different, but listen to their reason. The Essenes did not participate in temple services because they believed that the temple system was corrupt. Basically, the Sadducees who were running the temple, they weren't doing it right. And remember, it says that they would follow Pharisaic interpretations for the temple, but they didn't do it all the time. They did their own way, but when they had to, when they were pressured into doing it, they followed what the Pharisees said because they were afraid of the people. Their course of life is better than that of any other men, and they entirely devote themselves to husbandry, or raising livestock. So basically, they're shepherds. They're cattle raisers. They're goat raisers. They're sheep raisers. So, Josephus, what's interesting, Josephus is not an Essene. But he still says their course of life is better than that of other men. Why? Because they were Hasidim. They were very pious. They were lovers of kindness, lovers of charity, lovers of doing good to people. Josephus continues. He says, it also deserves our admiration how much they exceed all other men that devote themselves to virtue, and this in righteousness, meaning they devote themselves to righteousness and they do it in a righteous way. It's kind of like when Paul says, for we know that the law is good if a person uses it legally, right? Do the Torah in accordance with the Torah. And indeed, to such a degree that as it hath never appeared among any other man. So basically, the Essenes were the cream of the crop, the best of the best. This is demonstrated by that institution of theirs which will not suffer anything to hinder them from having all things in common, so that a rich man enjoys no more of his own wealth than he who has nothing at all. Kind of reminds us of when the apostles held everything in common, right? Why? Because they were Hasidim, right? Maybe we should turn this into a song because we're going to be saying it so much. Because they were Hasidim. So, some do not marry wives, nor are they desirous to keep servants, as thinking the latter tempts men to be unjust. So basically, to them, being a servant and being a slave is a horrible, horrible thing. They never want anybody to do that. What they would think of slavery in places such as America, they would be horrified. Absolutely horrified. Why? Because they say it tempts people to be unjust. They're not righteous people who do that. Now, what else is interesting is that the Essenes would vote for community stewards, quote, such as are good men and priests, to manage their resources. So basically, they had a certain amount of democracy in their communes. Nowadays, it might be likable or likened to socialism, but it's not the kind of socialism that we're familiar with. We're familiar with evil socialism that kills people, steals people's property. This is 100% consensual. People come and they have to go through a multi-year training process until they're even let in. Right? This was attractive to people. There's no jackbooted thugs. It's all, 100% consensual. So, without further ado, these are the three denominations within the Jewish people at this time, and I think our next lesson will actually be on the Essenes themselves, because they are so, I don't say they're immensely important, but they're very important for understanding the ancient Jewish world, and I think that they're a fascinating group. Maybe I'll make them optional because I already talked about them a little bit, but I think that you should watch them nonetheless. So I'll end with that. Have a good day. Be a chassid.